Hey, St. John. Welcome to the Post-Sermon Podcast. I am Deaconess Dehlia, and with me today is our seminarian, Tyler Martin. How are you, Tyler?
Hi, Deaconess. I'm good. Out here in lovely Missouri, Pastor Adam made a joke in the sermon about how humid it is here. And I'm currently outside and can confirm that it feels kind of like the jungle. But we're doing good. We're having fun.
Yeah, St. Louis does get very hot and humid summers, right?
They do, and they don't include, so it's really hot, it's really humid. They have a bunch of mosquitoes here, and they have these poisonous spiders that they don't have in Ohio. And none of that was included in the seminary, welcome package. So
they didn't tell you about that.
No, they hold it all until they've got you captive here. Had I known, though, I may have gone to Fort Wayne.
Wow, yeah, and then I know in the winters, too, you guys get, pretty bad ice.
Yeah, we get no snow. We can't have snow because that'd be too much fun. Well, we get lots and lots of ice. So it's summer, brutal, winter, brutal, but spring and fall each last about 3 weeks. And those are really pleasant here.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. So I'm glad we said something positive. Well, it's so great to have you on the podcast today. And I was really excited because, of course, we're going to be able to talk about your sermon on Sunday, which I thought was fantastic. But also, I know I am curious, as well as many members at St. John, just about you and your family at the seminary, what your experience has been like, what you guys have been up to, and of course, how you guys are doing. So let's talk first. Tell me, what has life been like for you and your family at the seminary?
All jokes about Missouri aside, the seminary experience so far has been incredible in a lot of different ways. I mentioned to a lot of people I talked to on Sunday how sometimes, especially with the coursework, it feels like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much information and you're getting it all so quickly. You're going to learn Greek. You're going to learn Hebrew. You're going to learn what the word exegesis means. And so all these things they're just kind of throwing at you to see sort of what sticks. And it's amazing, though, how much of it does stick and how much that really impacts not just how I hope to one day lead a congregation, but I mean, even my own personal formation, my own personal faith, just how much I've learned in such a remarkably small amount of time. So it's been great. It's been really great.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I was just wondering, too, do you have a favorite class that you've taken so far?
I do. So this is, not everyone would say this at the seminary, but one of the most sort of intimidating classes that we have in the seminary course load is systematics, which is really just the study of what makes up our theology, our church doctrine. And it can be a little intimidating because it's a lot of, in the legal world, we would call it black letter law. So it's all the rules and things that sort of shape or form how we view the Bible, how we view our faith, church history, all of it. And I really enjoy those classes. I think just because it reminds me so much of the law. It's kind of my happy place.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. I know when I was at Concordia, some of the Systemax classes we had, I was drawn to as well. But I remember, though, a lot of my classmates did not really like those classes. I don't know. I wonder if it just takes certain, I don't know, I guess we're all unique, right? If it just takes, some people are more drawn to that than others, but there's a lot. It's very detail oriented for sure.
It is extremely detail oriented, and you either love it or you really just don't like it at all. It's funny how few in between people there are when it comes to systems.
Right. Well, very good. And how are Catherine and Abby doing in St. Louis?
They're doing great. Catherine working fully remotely, still with the same firm that she was with when we were at St. John. She's found a great community of women and wives here at the seminary. That they formed a really tight-knit group. It's amazing to be in this community where if you ever need anything, you can go knock on a door and someone will find it for you pretty much immediately.
And you guys live on campus, right?
That's right. So we are on campus at the very back of the campus. It's a community called the Woods. And so back here, it's all seminary families, all married student housing. And so it's kind of like this little Lutheran utopia in the middle of St. Louis, which is just really fun to see.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool to just have that community, because there's going to be no other time in life where you have quite that same close-knit people who are all, like, everyone's kind of on the same path, right? To preparing to be a pastor, to, support a pastor. And I don't know, just to be there together sounds like a really, really awesome gift.
That's one of the things that struck me early on when we got to campus and sort of started getting more tied into this community is, and you hit it on the head with this one. I can't think of another time in life where everyone you're surrounded by is working toward the exact same goal. We're all here to do the same thing, to go to the same types of places, and all of that in service to the gospel. And so finding that community where you know exactly where people are coming from and you know exactly why they're here and what they're working toward, it just makes it really easy to make really good, really strong friendships, for sure.
And those, I mean, I'm sure some of those friendships will definitely be lifelong, even if you don't live near each other in proximity. I'm sure they're going to be brothers that you can be able to count on and call, just throughout your whole ministry, that you guys will be able to rely on each other.
No doubt. These are going to be the same people I'm asking questions to, hopefully 20 years from now. Mm-hmm. So for sure.
And thinking about, so this is your second year of seminary. So mm-hmm. What is the plan for next year? Is that vicarage?
Yeah. So next year is vicarage. I think we actually have our first of many pre-vicarage meetings sometime next week. And so they're going to be walking us through, sort of getting us ready for that big transition from the safety and security of the Woods out into a congregation for a year, which is a little intimidating at times, but also really exciting.
And I'm sure you'll find out a lot of information coming up in those meetings, but have you guys talked about it? Is there any part of the country that you'd like to live in for a year? I mean, I know you don't get a lot of say, right? But I don't know.
Right.
What were your thoughts?
So we've tried to be as open as possible. The one that I've nixed is I've heard rumors that, I don't know if it's every year, maybe every couple of years, but at some point someone has gone to Alaska. And I probably don't want Alaska. I like having a day and a night cycle that sort of makes sense. But outside of that, really, yeah. We talking to Catherine, we both agree that really wherever the seminary thinks a future ministry could best be shaped in a year, that's where we want to be. Mm-hmm. So wide open when it comes to geography and things like that.
Okay, very good. Yeah, no, I think that's a great mindset to have. And I guess it'll be is it April or May when they'll have the vicarage placement service?
That's a great question. I actually didn't go to it last year, but don't tell the seminary that.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, I think but it's around that time, I think.
It's somewhere in the neighborhood. I think that's right.
Okay. Well, very good. So preaching, let's get into that a little bit. You have now preached twice so far. Is that right?
That's right. I'm an expert in preaching. I've done it exactly twice.
So what is it like preparing for and then delivering a sermon?
There is nothing quite like it. I go through this process and I felt reassured when I found out that a professor I like in the homiletics department, who's just a master craftsman when it comes to putting together a sermon, went through in his time in the ministry, in the parish rather, process really similar to mine. So I always start off with an idea, like Pastor Adam told me to do a long, long time ago, of sort of what is the need of the congregation I want to address, and how is that need addressed through the gospel. And so that's always sort of the framing function that I go into looking at any of my texts, thinking about. And then from there, the struggle really begins. So I'm the type of person who I like to work on something as long as I have time to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm probably going to go through several iterations where I'll be pretty far along in a process and then just decide, this isn't where this needs to go. This isn't what needs to be said in this moment. And then I'll just scrap it and start over. And so I remember actually preparing this sermon for St. John. I had one of those moments pretty late in the process. And I went to Catherine and said, Catherine, I know I've been working on this for a pretty good amount of time now, but I'm pretty sure I just need to scrap it and start over. And she looked at me with a very serious face and said, Tyler, don't you dare throw the sermon away. And so I listened and I buckled down and I made some adjustments here and there and made some tweaks and some changes, but kept the majority of it. But it's that
so this was your original idea then. This wasn't like your do-over.
So this is one where I actually stuck with the original idea.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so it's this battle of knowing how serious the task at hand is and how important the function of preaching is in the life of the church, and trying to figure out how to best serve that need to the best of my ability. And I think that's something that a lot of pastors are constantly wrestling with. For some, including this professor I like so much, throughout their time in ministry. So it's a tough job. It's a tough job, but a fun job.
Yeah, I like what you said. I mean, I can imagine like you can just spend all of your time and then some, way more than like 1 week in preparing for a sermon. And I mean, that's probably one of the tough things that you guys have to wrestle with is like, when is it like good enough? Because there can always be something more that you can strive for, right?
Right. And that is, I think, something else that's important to mention there is I know for a lot of seminarians, at least myself included, is sometimes it can be easier to forget the bigger picture of what we're doing. And so I'll think to myself, this needs to be as good as I can possibly get it. This needs to be perfect. I need to be saying all the right things. I might need a joke there or a joke there. I need to make sure I get really serious in this moment. And all of that focus on the actual act of preaching, it can be tempting to forget that in reality, this is God doing God's work. The Holy Spirit is going to do whatever the Holy Spirit wills to do with any sermon. And try as hard as I might, I can never really get in the way of that. And so keeping that that frame of mind as present as I can is also helpful in those moments of just panic that this isn't good enough, that knowing you've put the work and you've put the time in, and God can do with it what God will.
I like that. So let's talk a little bit about the text that you preached on for this past Sunday. What was the text?
Yeah, so we were in 1 Kings chapter 17, which is a really, really fun chapter because it's where we get introduced to Elijah, which is, as you know, this is God's prophet that we're talking about. All the incredible things that Elijah did throughout his ministry, representing the prophet so well that he appears alongside the transfigured Christ and Moses at the transfiguration. Mm-hmm. And so getting that introduction to Elijah, and at the start of chapter 17, and then fast forward to where we are in the text, and we also get the very first resurrection in the Bible. It's a big text. It's a big text with a lot going on. And so that was part of the struggle really with putting everything together. Is there are so many different directions that you could go with this because there are so many important things happening in this moment. How do you choose just one?
Yeah, and I was looking at all the readings of the gospel and the epistle. I mean, they all go so well together. So did you, was part of your preparation using the epistle and gospel as well to inform you, with getting the sermon ready, or did you just try to focus on 1 Kings?
Yeah, so I primarily focused on 1 Kings just because I read that and I got to the part where Elijah is praying, asking asking God to return this widow's son and asking why God brought calamity on the widow with whom he sojourned. And as soon as I got to calamity, that just raises questions. That single word raised enough questions that I felt like this is something that really deserves to be talked about. And so pretty early in the process, I honed in on First Kings. But like you said, I was something that I'm always really pleasantly surprised by anytime I look at the one-year lectionary, which the church I am currently working with is on the 3-year, so I don't see it too often. But especially in the 1 year, the readings for each Sunday can be so really well put together. And so you've got this resurrection occurring in your Old Testament reading. You've got Christ performing a resurrection of a different widow's son in your New Testament reading. And then in your epistle, you have Paul talking about suffering for Christ. And so all of this sort of comes together to paint this really beautiful picture of some of the struggles that we can encounter just as in our Christian walks.
Sure. And, it's kind of funny when you were preaching this and you were going through the Old Testament story, there were at times I got it mixed up as like, oh, he's talking about the gospel story. And it's like, oh, no. It's the other one. But that just shows how close they are, though. And I don't know. Like, I think that'd be interesting if other people maybe had that moment too. But yeah, no, that's really cool how they all tie together like that. Mm-hmm. So what was the central teaching of your sermon?
Yeah, so what I really focused in on in this sermon, it was the question of, as Christians, how should we respond when bad things happen? Which is really a foundational question to our faith. And it kind of gets into the issue, the technical name for it is theodicy, of we have this all-powerful, all-good God, but bad things still happen. And what do we do with that? And so that was the central question that I really wanted to dive into. And then in answering that question, I think the only way you can really go, we'll never know the mind of God. We're just creatures. And so we aren't going to have all those answers, all those explanations that we might want. And so what has God, the author of all things, given us? And that is Christ. It's good Sunday school answer. It's always Jesus. But here, in response to all the bad things that can happen, God also gave us his son, who went through so many bad things himself, just so that we could be God's children too. And so taking that theodicy question, that concern about what we do with an all-powerful God who somehow still allows bad things to happen, and shifting our focus, keeping our eyes only on God, but shifting our focus on the promise he's given us that ultimately everything will be well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think you in this sermon, you decided to I guess you didn't have a choice because of the reading, but you decided to tackle a really difficult question and one that speaks to everyone, and whatever their suffering is that they're going through. Like you said, how should we respond when bad things happen? Why do these happen? And I do appreciate in your sermon that you didn't, there's that strong temptation for us to try to answer that why question, but you didn't do that, right? I mean, I remember in your sermon, you plainly said I don't know why this happened, but you did then point it back to Christ. I do know that God is there in that suffering.
Right. And that temptation in trying to answer that question, and you see it really often, even among the best meaning Christians. Sometimes when we're trying to address that, we can turn the all-powerful God of the universe into a victim who has to suffer through all the bad things that happen himself and is just unable to do anything about it. Or maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum, you turn our good Heavenly Father into sort of this callous villain who just willy-nilly does whatever he wants to with his creation. And I think any time that you start moving toward either of those places, you're really missing the whole point that our goal here is always the proclamation of the gospel. And so rather than trying to explore things that we're never really going to know, it's how does even this point to Jesus?
Yeah, so in the way you kind of started out this sermon was with one of your favorite book series, a series of unfortunate events, which I thought was fantastic how you went with that. And you brought up how we like to have a villain to blame our troubles on, like how in Series of Unfortunate Events, it was Count Olaf.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that in a way, can it feel like God is the villain for us when these like very arbitrary, like almost cruel things happen to us and we know God is in control? Can I don't know, can we feel like God is the one to blame? Like he's the villain?
Yeah, for sure. I think that anytime we encounter sort of just the reality of unexplicable evil or unexplicable hardship, that question is always going to come, why would God let this happen? I believe I try my best to be a faithful Christian. Why are bad things happening to me? And whenever we're asking that question, it can be really tempting to think that, and this was a really central point of the sermon, that maybe God has decided that he's turning against us, or maybe God has just forgotten about us. And so in that, I think that there can be a real temptation to try to recreate the story of creation itself by making God our bad guy.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the readings too. I mean, well, you said you had focused on that word calamity, right? In verse 20, what Elijah cried to the Lord. And I mean, that is an interesting line. It says here, "O Lord, my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" And I don't think we can stretch it to say, like, I'm not sure Elijah would say God's like a villain, but he's very much going to God, like, hey, look what is happening. Look what you did. You can kind of almost imagine the confusion or the devastation that Elijah's having in that moment too with the widow.
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is who he just saved, this widow and her son, from famine. God equipped him to perform a miracle to keep them alive. And then we turn around, and the very next place the reading goes is that the widow's son dies, while Elijah was even living in their house. And so that is what's so striking about Elijah's response there. And I think what's so faithful about it too is he doesn't really try to get into that question of theodicy. He doesn't try to explain why bad things happen. He doesn't point the finger at Ahab, who the famine was over. He doesn't point the finger at this widow. He doesn't try to make excuses. He just looks to God and acknowledges God is in control. What is God going to do next? And the response from the author of all creation is to answer in a faithful way that history could have never predicted, because a resurrection had never happened before.
So then tell us, and I think you're getting to this with the resurrection, in your sermon, how then did you get to Jesus? How was Jesus the medicine?
So Jesus was the medicine here. It's sort of the greater thing to come. Well, it's not sort of. Christ truly is the greater thing to come in this instance. So we have, back in the time of the prophet Elijah, a pretty long way to go until we get to Christ's birth. We have this image of resurrection, something that in the history of creation hadn't happened. No one had ever been raised from the dead. And even within all the Mid-Eastern religions at this point in time, that isn't even necessarily something that a pagan believer, or maybe even a Jewish monotheistic believer, would think God could or would do. Death was just considered to be pretty permanent. But here, responding to this widow and her grief and in her pain, God raises her child from the dead. And so that, even when bad things happen, that is who our God is. Our God is someone who always meets us in our grief. And then fast forward, it's easy to say, well, in my own life, I've lost people and they haven't been raised from the dead. So where is God in that? But really the point of where I was going in the gospel of our sermon is that God has showed us his faithfulness to us in a way that would have been completely incomprehensible to this widow. Not only does God raise someone that we would care about, God raises Christ himself, the Son of God. Christ, the deity, dies for us and then is raised again from the dead so that we might have eternal life with him. And so in terms of just a promise of faithfulness, it doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, and I love the end of your sermon, especially when you're talking about like the ending, that you've made it to the end of the series, but God, like the author, has already spoiled the ending. And then once again, just pointing to Christ, that we do have eternal life in him now and forever when Christ comes again. How did you intend to benefit your hearers in their faith or life?
What I really was hoping to do with this sermon was to let everyone know I can't know every struggle, every hardship in the congregation. I do keep up with the prayer chains, and so I have an idea of what's going on at St. John always, and St. John is always in my prayers. But like you mentioned earlier, this idea of struggle and hurt, it's something that all of us can connect with. And so what I hope to do with this sermon was just to show people that even when we are going through really bad times, and we're going through these intense struggles, or we encounter a tragedy that defies all explanation, that like this widow and like Elijah, we don't necessarily need to go looking for excuses or answers. Even in the midst of our worst days, it's okay to keep looking to God, because he's always going to give us that answer and what Christ did on the cross for us. And so if there was one big takeaway from this, it would be, no matter what it is you might be going through, just keep focusing on God, because I promise you, he will answer faithfully.
What was a challenge for you with the sermon process? You'd mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you almost just started over completely. What in particular was so challenging about this?
So what's so interesting with this sermon is that this problem of evil in the face of an all-good, all-powerful God, it's something that I think all of us wrestle with all the time. And so what was really interesting for me in my sermon process was going through the different units of my sermon, talking about all the struggle that happens in the world, talking about all the struggle that happens in this reading. This go around, that came really easily for me. I was able to connect with that and write about that, and put that down on paper without too much work. And then it was time to get to the gospel part of my sermon. And that's actually where I really started to struggle, because in that moment, you've raised this question of theodicy, this question of why did these things happen? And even when you know you shouldn't, it can just be so tempting to try to respond to that and try to answer that question, which we just can't. We can't do it. And so I struggled with the gospel because I really wanted to answer a question that is just so far beyond me that I couldn't really conceive of it. And so then I had to sort of refocus and take a step back and remember that in those moments, what we're really left with is what God has given us. And that's the proclamation of the gospel. It's proclamation of what Jesus did for us. And that's the only answer we're going to get. But at the end of the day, that answer is more than sufficient. And so sort of taking a step back and refocusing myself in the sermon process to make sure that I kept my eyes squarely on God too, was part of putting everything together that I struggled with for a pretty good while, but ultimately was happy with how I was able to answer that question.
So I do have a here submitted question, but it's more of a lighthearted question, just to warn you. So
Well,
you
first,
had.
can I say though real quick?
Oh yes, sorry, yes.
So I've always wondered in all the podcasts whether or not Pastor Adam was always clued in on all of the here submitted questions, because his responses are he gives really good responses. But sitting here on the podcast, I can confirm that there was no heads up about any questions. So that's just Pastor Adam being a rock star and always knowing just what to say.
That's a great question.
So with that said, let me plug
it
this
depends. It depends what the questions are. Like he does get a heads up on a lot of them. So he does. Okay. And there are times like if it's a tough one, he might, pull a resource to kind of help figure out, how he wants to go about the answer. So,
well, now you're destroying my whole mythology.
Well, trying to realize, Pastor Adam, you're right though. He is great at answering the questions, but he gets a little bit of heads up. In this one, I didn't think you needed a whole lot of heads up for, so I don't know. So the question is, what book is your favorite of the series that you talked about? So series of unfortunate events.
That's a good question.
Maybe you did need a heads up for it. I don't know.
I maybe did need a heads up because it's been a very long time since I read these books. The one that stuck with me the most was probably the very first one, The Bad Beginning. Just because I even mentioned this in my sermon, that disclaimer at the beginning, where Lemony Snicket, the pen name of the author, he just goes on and on and on about how this is not a happy book and there is not a happy ending and you're not going to get any good things in this story. And I remember just as a kid picking that up and reading it and thinking, I've never in my life seen anything quite like this. And also thinking that there was no way that was actually going to be true, because that's just not how stories work. There's something okay happening, and then something bad happens, and then something worse happens. But then we climb our way back up and we end up in a pretty good place. But that isn't really the point of a series of unfortunate events.
And that's why you said,
word.
Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, you're good.
I was just going to say, and you had mentioned this is like why it resonates with children, or you thought was just because, whether you're a child or an adult, like everyone has unfortunate events. And so even kids. And so it did resonate with them for that reason, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Just that theme that sometimes things just get worse. It was so unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and it stuck with me ever since. And so I'd have to say The Bad Beginning is my number one book, just because it was so different from anything that I'd ever seen as a kid growing up.
See, I think you did good. You didn't need any. You didn't need to know that question in advance.
That's good. See, if you give me that question in advance, I probably would have spent way too much time reviewing every single one of those books. So I appreciate that.
Oh man. Well, good. And it's kind of funny talking about all of this, just with your sermon, and you really went into the direction of like story, right? And I don't know if you've read this book, if you had to read this at seminary, or if Pastor Adam has recommended it to you. I know he suggested it to me, and I love the book. It's by Buechner, and it's The Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. Does that sound familiar?
It's really interesting. I'm not making this up. Truly, within the last month, 2 other people have recommended that book to me.
Really?
I've never read the book, but
you have to.
I hear it mentioned a lot.
You
and now
have
I feel
to.
like I need to make an Amazon order.
It's a very short book, but just what you are saying in your sermon, of tragedy in life, and then of course there's the comedy aspect of like, he goes into like when Abraham and Sarah were found out that Sarah was going to have a baby, and they laughed. So the comedy
Just
aspect,
laughs.
and then fairy tale, just that these out of this world things can happen, can just break into the mundane, and how we're drawn to that, and it all points to Christ. Anyways, just what that book's talking about a lot, what you're saying in here, there's a really good connection. So highly recommend that. Pastor Adam, you can keep that in the podcast or you can edit that out. I just wanted to mention that to Tyler. And yeah, if you've had 2 other people mention that book to you,
I've got to pick
have
it up.
to.
I don't have a choice now. I have to pick it up.
You have to. And like I said,
But
it's really short read, but very profound.
Well, and that whole theme too, it fits really well with sort of where we are as a culture. Because I mean, we exist in a time and a place around the seminary. We love to throw around the word postmodern, but we live in a world where things like that don't happen, where it's cold and it's calculating and everything can be explained by a formula. And so sometimes getting more of that story narrative, that story explanation for the things that we see and that we encounter, which is how we communicated with each other for so long throughout human history. It can be refreshing in a way just to get back to that. Mm-hmm. So I will pick up that book.
And I think people are a lot more drawn to story even in that postmodern culture, like because it's just part of who we are. And he'll bring up like why people are like kind of obsessed with the demonic or with, exorcisms or, different things like that. People, even though they're very rationalistic with things, they still kind of are drawn to things that don't really make sense with, what they see in their day to day. So anyways, but it's all kind of pointing back to that story of God, of Christ breaking into this creation. And even if we don't believe that story, like, because it's true, we just, like everyone, Christian or not Christian, are kind of drawn to that, So it's interesting. Yeah. So I think you would like it.
Yeah, I'm sold. I'm gonna, as soon as we're off this podcast, I'm gonna hop on Amazon and hopefully get a 1-day order.
Perfect. You'll have to let me know what you think of it. All right. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for taking the time talking about seminary life and then this sermon. Definitely looking forward. It's amazing to think this is just your second sermon, and to just, I don't know, I'm looking forward to, for you, I know it might be a while, but I'm looking forward to you coming back, getting to preach again, and just being able to see that formation. So thank you for coming on and talking to me for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a ton of fun to be able to be a part of this. And I'm really looking forward to see where I am the next time I'm able to come back and preach again, because I have no doubt that I will have grown a lot by then. So looking forward to that one and for our next conversation.
Very good. All right, you guys, this wraps up the episode for today. Thank you for listening to our discussion. In case you missed the sermon or you'd like to listen to it again, the link to the sermon's in the show notes. You can also find it on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you, the listener, would like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. Well, thank you, Tyler, for joining me and for feeding us the word this week.
Yeah, you're welcome. See you, Deaconess, and bye, St. John.
Okay, take care, you guys. Bye.